I've hit the record, so it's all over to you.
Awesome. Hello, guys. Yeah, so thanks to Richard and thanks for David keeping things held down in the chat there. So as I said, my name is Rory, and today we're going to be talking about how we spread good ideas in a healthcare and medical context. So I guess a good idea to start with would be a little bit about who I am and why you should listen to me. So I am a copywriter, which has nothing to do with copyright law. Don't worry, we're all safe. I am the one who writes the copy, that is the words. Could be on your website, ebook, guide, brochure, social media, whatever. If it's words, I'll do that. And we're called Sookio. We're based over in Cambridge. And we've worked for the likes of UK Parliament, Cambridge University. We do a lot with BAE, but don't watch any of that. You can tell I'm a good copywriter because I'm bald and I've got a beard. But Cambridge also being what it is, it's also a lot of healthcare and related tech. We've got Addenbrooke's here, we've got Papworth, and that needs to be articulated really, really carefully, because when you're spreading good ideas in a healthcare context, it's quite often a matter of life and death. So that takes good copywriting. So another good idea would be to start with what good copywriting looks like. My definition is that good copywriting is the art and science of convincing an audience by providing as much information in as few words as possible. Now, if that sounds broad, it's because it is, because everyone's a copywriter. If you've ever so much as written a job application, if you've written an email to your boss asking for a new desk chair, you are a copywriter, so you might as well be a good one. And now I can't make you a better writer in 20 minutes. If I could, I wouldn't be taking the train to work. But what I can do is give you 4 or 5 tips, quick wins, things that you can immediately do to tweak your project structure and sort of the mentality within your organization to try and get good ideas and how to get out there, help them spread further. Now, in practice, this comes down to 2 things in my experience. It comes down to distance and translation. Now, distance, that is distance from your subject matter. And I can articulate this with a little story. I was at a networking event not long ago, got talking to this guy about social media. And he says, oh, we'd love to do more social media, but what we do is really boring. Well, I'm trapped in the conversation now, so I've got to ask, what do you do? He made lasers, like medical lasers, not party lasers like these. But the fact remains that there's nothing cooler on this earth than lasers. But when you do something for 8, 9, 10 hours of every day, you lose that spark. You lose distance from what is initially interesting to your subject matter that brought you in and got you excited about it. So I guess the first important lesson for how to spread good ideas is to get that distance from your subject matter. Make use of lay opinions. If you've got junior members of staff, if you've got interns, if you've got volunteers, bring them in on your messaging and your creative meetings and listen to them if they're saying that something is going over their heads. Likewise, stuff that is really exciting and cutting edge to you, that's going to be way over the head of the layman. So one thing I'll often recommend is to call family members. Grab your mum, grab your auntie, show her the first 2-3 paragraphs of a blog you've written or a landing page or even a tweet, and ask them 3 things. It's like, does it grab their attention? Do they notice it? Is it of use and value to them as a lay audience? Is it clear? And yeah, is it communicated in a way that can understand? So that's distance. Now, translation, that's translation obviously from one audience to another with different levels of technical understanding. We did some work not long ago for a company called OpenIO Labs. Now, what they did was they made a magic box that you can plug any 2 bits of laboratory equipment into. So you've got your microscope from one vendor, you've got your thermometer from another vendor, plug them into the magic box and they'll play nicely with one another without having to buy all your lab equipment from one person, which is simple, right? So that explanation that I've just given you there was the result of a day-long messaging meeting because they wanted to talk about stuff like Internet of Things, IoT. They wanted to talk about data transparency, cloud portability. They wanted to talk about this could be used to run smart hospitals. Hugo would have loved these guys. But we're at an investor case at the minute, and the investors wanted to hear about the magic box. I should stress that's not my client's product. That is a child in a cardboard box. But when you're using Unsplash for your stock photography, you kind of got to work with what you're given. So yeah, but note also that nothing that was said over the course of that day-long messaging meeting was wrong. It wasn't incorrect. It just got in the way of the message we were trying to tell at that point, which was the investor case. So I guess the second important lesson for how to spread good ideas is to balance accuracy with clarity. And let's take a look at how this works out in practice. I'm going to show you 2 web pages about stomachache, or rather abdominal pain. This is the Wikipedia page on abdominal pain. Great name for a heavy metal band, terrible name for something when you're trying to give people sort of comfort in a medical context. Abdominal pain, also known as stomachache, is a symptom associated with both non-serious and serious medical issues. Good heavens. If I've woken up at 3 in the morning with a bad stomachache and I come to this page, oh God, common causes of pain in the abdomen include blah, blah, blah. About 15% of people have a more serious underlying condition, such as appendicitis, leaking or ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. I might even have an ectopic pregnancy if I come to this page. Now, if you're somebody who has a stomachache in that morning, you're far more likely to get more value from this. Now, this is the NHS page on stomachache. The NHS are absolutely fantastic at communicating clearly. Stomachache. Most stomachaches are not anything serious and will go away after a few days. Common causes of stomachache. These are some common types of stomachache and what may be causing them, but see a GP if you're unsure and worried. The NHS page is great, whereas the Wikipedia page tries to be all things to all men. So I guess another good idea, a good lesson for how to spread good ideas is to make sure each communication should be doing one job for one defined audience, which we'll come to later. But if you're writing blogs or articles or white papers, and then it's running, so say your blog is running to 2,500 words and it's careening through 2 or 3 different subjects, what you've got there is 2 or 3 different blogs, and that's a fantastic problem to have, because you can play the numbers game and ensure that you're putting one clearly defined idea, one clearly defined message in front of the right clearly defined audience. Let's look at what happens when the messaging does kind of meander and it's sort of falling from its intended purpose. Sorry, guys, we've got to talk about COVID very briefly because it is a perfect example of messaging going astray. Let's look at the first on the left here, the first bit of government messaging when the crisis immediately hit. Stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. Perfect. So stay at home, that gives me clarity. That is one easy action that I can take or not take in this instance in order to get to the second thing, protect the NHS. And that gives immediacy. We all have a personal connection to the NHS. We all recognize the threat that it was faced with. We all want to come together to do it, to bring us to the third point, save lives. Brilliant. So how did we go so wrong with the second one? Stay alert. That's just vagary. I'm alert for cars when I cross the street. I'm alert for when my in-laws are coming over so I can arrange overtime. Inviting people to stay alert 24/7, that's just an invitation to paranoia and madness. Control the virus. The virus is this massive overarching global thing. I certainly can't get my head around the sheer enormity of it in the same way that I can connect with the desire to protect the NHS. Save lives. Third, same clearly defined outcome. But there's no path to get there because the messaging has been muddied. Now, this isn't just a cheap pop at Boris. This is what happens when third-party concerns are introduced to what was previously very clear messaging. Now, whenever you think about this fact, the second messaging was affected by economic concerns. There still needs to be an economy. There still needs to be a country for us to come back to when all this is over. If I'd been given that brief, I would have talked about building a sense of community through staying alert and what have you. I would have talked about duty. People hate obligations, but they love doing their duty. Unfortunately, they went back to the well on the first set of messaging, and it was poorly received. However, for our purposes, that's good because it gives us a fourth important lesson for how to spread good ideas, and that's to adapt your messaging to new material context. You might have had messaging that's worked for years. You might have had a mascot that's worked for years in getting your message across. Larry the Llama might have worked fantastically, but the world is changing. It might be time to put Larry the Llama out to pasture. So once you're not afraid to step away from older messaging, if it's no longer working, we reach a point where we can start to really dig into what makes one example work and another not work, because they're all written in plain language. Now, if you've ever written any kind of content in a healthcare setting, you'll probably be sick of hearing about plain language, the case for plain language. And it's not just dumbing down for the layman. The desire for plain language, and studies show and the stats prove that the desire for plain language increases the more complex the idea is being expressed, and the higher the level of education and the greater expertise of the reader. And that comes down to why people read, why people interact with messaging. They don't read complex things to feel or look clever. They read things to assimilate information and act on it as quickly as possible. Now, in a medical healthcare context, very rarely do we have the luxury of being able to assimilate messaging in a neutral, sort of calm, stress-free state. What you really want to be doing, and the real case for plain language, is in easing the cognitive load. Now, the cognitive load is literally how much brain sweat it takes you to look at a word or a piece of messaging or a tweet or a blog or a white paper and take it in. And there's two competing / complementary theories about how we read words. The first is boomer shape theory. It comes from a guy called Herman Boomer, who suggests that we actually learn the first 10,000 or so words in any language by shape. So you don't read cat like C-A-T. You learn the shape of the word cat, and you read it like that. We'll read it by shape. The second theory is called parallel recognition theory, which is slightly more contemporary. And it suggests that we actually read all the letters of a familiar word simultaneously. So we don't read C before A before T. We read C, A, and T at the same time. And that's how we process familiar words. Either way, if you're using simple plain language, this happens. Normally when I do this slide with people sort of in a live audience, I get a little, oh, kind of thing. Yeah, you get it now. So a perfect story to articulate this is actually from Sue, the director of the agency I work for, who unfortunately not long ago, her mother had cancer, had breast cancer. And she was up there at Addenbrooke's, where a lot of great work gets done. But unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, the doctor she was consulting with at the time wasn't fantastic, didn't have a great bedside manner, standing up rather than sitting down and talking to her and her mum on a level, hitting her with all the jargon, all the medical things. You could tell she's very busy, had to just rattle it off and get about her day. It was a leaflet from Macmillan that Sue actually took the most comfort from in that context, because as we're seeing here, plain language that can be assimilated even in the most stressed states. So here we're at a point where we have to distinguish between language and meaning, and accept that sometimes actually language gets in the way of meaning. Don't think of language as water, which will take the form of any jug you pour it into. Language is the jug, which is the fifth, probably the most important lesson I've certainly come across for helping good ideas spread. It's that language is inseparable from context. Plain isn't simple. Finding plain language for your context is actually remarkably difficult, and it takes an incredible amount of work. It goes back to what Shelley was saying about audience profiling, avatars. Finding plain language for your context is about building profiles for the audience that speak in that context. And there's two ways that I generally would do that. The first is in sort of a microcosm kind of sense, building audiences by identity. And then the second is the macrocosm sense. That's building audiences by culture. What does this look like in practice? This is from the Health Equality and Rights Organization, HERO, who were tasked to come up with a campaign that encourages gay and bisexual Black men to get tested for HIV. So here we're working with an audience who might not only feel marginalized based on race, they might also feel marginalized within that ethnic community because of their sexuality. So there's audiences within audiences, there's identities within identities, and there's traps laid for the unwary. So what they did was to actually imagine this, they were bringing gay and bisexual Black men in on every stage of the creative. And what emerged was this: we test for HIV because we look out for each other, me, him, us, because when your back's against the wall, all you have are the people that are closest to you. And that was what came across through this creative, and that's what resulted in this very well-received campaign that worked, that did drive more testing and did protect more lives. So that's identity. What do I mean when I say building audiences based on culture? Well, here's another one from the UK Sepsis Trust. The biggest killer is not the usual suspect. Not prostate cancer, it's not breast cancer, it's not bowel cancer. Sepsis kills more people in the UK every year than all those three combined. And obviously we're leaning there on the Usual Suspects poster. Now, I've never actually seen The Usual Suspects, the film. I was not a big fan of Kevin Spacey before it was cool, but I get it. Yeah, I understand the trope. So don't be afraid to lean on pop culture, on memes, on tropes. Danny Bear from Shelley's talk was the perfect example. What do you see? Oh, it's a cute bear. Right. So I immediately understand that there's a message, an encouraging, inclusive, warm message going to be delivered here, and it works. So yeah, build your audience's identity and trust them to get, credit them with the intelligence to understand cultural context. What happens though when we're building audiences and conceiving of communities that are a little bit more tricky? I want to close with an example of a rare disease charity that I've done a lot of work with. They're called Find a Cure, based here in Cambridge. Now, the EU defines a rare disease as something affecting fewer than 1 in 2,000 people, but often it's far rarer than that. Sometimes you're the only person who might have this condition. You might be one of a handful in human history who have ever had this condition. They work with 7,000 rare disease patient groups. And so how do you make one clearly defined message for 7,000 different audiences? Now, I sat down with the then CEO of Find a Cure. We came up with 3 beats to hit. When building audience profiles, identify common needs. It turns out that 7,000 rare disease patient groups all want some pretty similar things. That's a platform, that's resources, that's infrastructure, and that's support. Build your message around that and you're away in a hack, you're golden. Acknowledge internal and external challenges. This is especially true in, I think, healthcare contexts. Certainly from my experience, people are very risk averse. People don't want to present problems within the messaging. But you're leaving money on the table there because a good story has stakes, it has tension, it has things to be overcome. So acknowledge those internal and external challenges. Acknowledge the isolation that rare disease patient groups feel. Acknowledge the sort of lack of access to funding and resources and recognition that they might feel. Build your messaging around overcoming that. And the third point, ignore everybody else. If your messaging is not for somebody, if you're never going to work with somebody, if you're never going to help somebody or do business with them, leave them out of the messaging, because if you try to construct something that is for everybody, you end up with something vague and beige that appeals to nobody. So I guess, yeah, I'm trying to bash through this. So let's summarize what to my mind are the 5 big pillars of how to spread good ideas. And that's to get distance from your subject matter. That's to balance accuracy with clarity. That's let each communication do one clearly defined job. And that's to adapt your messaging to new material context in a changing world. And finally, language is inseparable from context. Thanks so much for listening, guys. And thanks to everyone for bringing me in. I understand we've got a really broad audience today who are all sort of different levels and all different stages of the journey. So if you want to have a chat, and we'll probably bash onto some questions now, but if you've got some spare time this afternoon and you want to book a little chat to talk about your specific challenges, what you're facing in your organization, do head to sookio.com/chat. You'll be able to book a slot to 20 minutes this afternoon. We'll be able to chat about what you're facing. And from there, I guess it's over to questions. Thank you, guys.
That was excellent, Rory. Brilliant. Hopefully your mother-in-law wasn't listening there.
No, I don't think she knows how to use the internet.
We recorded that. We'll edit it out for you. I was just going to say that what the example you used about the COVID messaging and like the first message being really clear and the second one not. What would you have done with that second message? Is it when it's more of a complex message, is it possible to simplify it that much like they did for the first one? Or would you have just said, no, we shouldn't try and make it that simple now?
I think it could have been made that simple, definitely. Sorry, I did touch on this, but not in enough detail. I mean, you've got to look at what we're actually trying to get people to do, which is exercise common sense. Common sense is reinforced by other people, right? Being human is a habit. We learn how to be human from being around one another. So yeah, as I was saying, I would base the messaging around sort of duty and community, and I think we Brits like campness. I would have made it a little bit more camp. You know, we respond quite well to wartime messaging. So like, Britain, do your duty, stay alert, kind of thing. Rather than just trying to rehash the format. I think the format, we would have had to move away from that clear 3-point thing, just because the first messaging had such a clearly defined purpose.
Yeah.
I would have expanded the messaging, maybe put out more individual sort of posters and whatnot, because it is a more complex proposition. But it would have been doable, yeah.
Okay. So a question from David. Do you have any battles with clients who already have a firm idea of what they want to communicate, how they want to do it, which sometimes means you have to compromise how you would approach that campaign?
Yes. And unfortunately, if somebody can answer how to get that across and how to get clients to acknowledge best practice when they are fully entrenched, they're better than me, and they deserve to make a lot more money. No, I think you've got to acknowledge the internal tensions so the best thing about being agency side is that we're parachuting into all these different organizations, all these different universes. So we're never quite subject to the same internal politics. So it's about balancing that understanding that we are probably coming to them with best practice, but the context is such that best practice might not always be possible. It might not always get signed off. The best you can do is do your job in the first instance and then try to educate the client and come with a fair compromise. It's about dropping the ego and coming with a compromise, I think, but it is tricky. I don't envy anyone that has those problems.
Does it come down to personal opinion? You know, you've put your case there and said, this is what we think. And then is it a case of your opinion versus theirs? Or do you bring any analytics or stats into it to build that case?
You've got to lead with the stats. You've got to make a data-driven case. That's why in the little definition of good copywriting I gave at the start, I call it an art and a science, because a lot of it is subjective, and a lot of people will have subjective ideas on objective best practice that is backed by data. Yeah. As long as you're coming to the table with those stats and coming armed, the conversation will be made a lot easier for yourself.
I like the usual suspects slide that you'd put up there. Have you got any examples of maybe the riskiest campaigns or slogans that you've done?
We were working with an eye care. They make contact lenses, and this was a video project which I was only sort of involved with the periphery of. But they're making a new type of contact lens with a slightly softer, more malleable, more easy on the eye, and they wanted to do something like don't go hard, go soft, kind of thing. With the obvious connotations there, that didn't get past creative, but I think it probably should have done. Because again, and I've got to say this, we've got to be bolder with our messaging. There is so much content being thrown at the internet on a daily basis that you need to be braver in order to cut through the noise. Yeah. You need to be a bit daring, a bit risque, and you need to put yourself out there, because otherwise you're just making content. You're not spreading a message.
So we've still got a couple of minutes. If anybody else wants to put any questions either in the chat or the Q&A. Just on that sort of risque messaging, does it depend on the audience you're going for? Is there any evidence to show that the more risque or the more strong the message is, the more it gets looked at?
This is a opinion that I'm happy to be contradicted on. I am a bit of a believer in the all publicity is good publicity kind of thing. Yeah. So like the whole, I mean, it's not a healthcare context thing, but look at Kylie Jenner when she handed the Pepsi can to the riot officer and saved the world. I hadn't watched a Pepsi advert in years before that, but I went out of my way to look at that. I might have even drank a can of Pepsi that week. I don't know. I can't quite remember. But yeah, I think genuinely, if you're talking about data, matching certain audiences to more or less appetite for risk, I don't have that, but I would argue that your audience is generally less risk averse than you are. And that's why you need to be bringing them in, actual end users of the message in on the creative to see what will work and what won't. The appetite for risk is always generally higher than you worry it might be.
And in the public sector, obviously that's, they're usually risk averse. Would you encourage it even in that sort of sector?
Yeah. Because while the sector itself is different to the private sector, the audience aren't. You're still providing messages for human beings, and human beings don't live in your brand bubble. They don't have, they're not subject to your brand guidelines and messaging and whatnot, which are brought to you from the first day that you work there. Human beings, I think it's a nice idea that we want human beings to be, the human experience to be this broad, indecipherable thing. unfortunately, we're a lot simpler than that. Human beings are quite conditioned to respond to a pretty narrow set of stimuli. So if you can get there, actually, it's a good time to mention AIDA. There's a copywriting formula called AIDA. A, attention; I, interest; D, desire; A, action. And if you're hitting those four across the stretch of your communication, you're onto a really good thing. But the first of those is attention. I think we're bombarded by something like 4,000 marketing messages or marketing communications every day, of which we notice about 4 to 8. So yeah, no matter who you are, no matter what sector, you need to be cutting through the noise there.
Okay. Just one last question before we move on to Jack's VR presentation. Just in terms of this new world and the virtual meeting environment, have you found any problems with that, rather than being face-to-face with people when trying to put across creative ideas?
No, actually. In fact, it becomes a lot easier to show supporting media when you are pitching an idea virtually. So if you're bringing an idea that needs a lot of context explained in live, you've got to have it there to show. You've got to have the print out to go, what? Generally, when you're making a pitch virtually, you can just send links to YouTube videos that sort of explain what you're aiming at, give the context and what have you. It is one of the saving graces of doing everything virtually, is that you can package an idea a lot more efficiently.
Oh, that's great, Rory. Really appreciate you taking the time this morning to come and present for us. And as we've said, we'll share all these presentations. We've done the recording, so we'll get those out next week. Thanks very much, Rory. I'm going to stop the recording session now.